The whole thing began a couple of years ago when Joe Hunrath and I were up in Cassiar, British Columbia, hunting caribou. There were 5 of us up there that year, all guys from back home in Idaho. But Joe Hunrath and I were the only ones in the hunting party that had made the trip to this section of British Columbia regularly every year for the past 6 years. We were staying in the same cabin, in the wilderness up above Telegraph Creek, that Joe and I had used for the past 6 springs. There was great hunting up around Cassiar. Caribou, moose, grizzly bear, wolf, stone sheep, and mountain goats. We'd never come back empty-handed from any of our past trips. And this time, just 2 days after we'd got there, a couple of us had bagged a mountain goat apiece, and Joe, the best shot among us, had got himself a bull moose. "Nice shooting, Joe," I said, and I meant it when we dragged the carcass back to the cabin that night and began skinning it. He'd brought the moose down with 5 shots from his .30-08 Winchester, drilling the shots into the animal's chest, one almost on top of the other, leaving the head undamaged. "Hell," Joe said, "he was practically on top of me when I opened fire. I would have had trouble missing him." Joe was a very quiet guy. He'd been pretty much a loner all his life, and he wasn't easy to get close to, even though we'd been friends for quite a while now. But I could see he was pleased when the whole gang of us celebrated his kill with a beer party in the cabin that night. It was the next day that this odd thing happened that was to change Joe's life, although at the time I didn't realize how important it was to become. We were in the woods about 1.25 miles from the cabin, near the same place where Joe had shot his moose the day before when we flushed out a big buck with massive antlers from the trees. The startled buck plunged from the clearing and into the brush, and all of us spread quickly, moving in different directions into the woods to encircle him. A few minutes later, I heard Joe yell, "He's headed back into the clearing! Get him!" I ran back and reached the clearing just about the same time as a couple of the other guys got there. The buck was standing, head upraised, well down from us. And before any of us could get a shot off, the buck bolted and bounded back into the trees right about where Joe should have been. We could hear the buck thrashing around in the underbrush, and I expected the crack of Joe's Winchester to come at any moment. Instead, I heard only the sound of the buck receding into the brush in the distance, and a few minutes later Joe came walking slowly out of the trees, a rifle under his arm. "Hey, what happened?" I shouted to Joe. "How come you missed him?" Joe looked up as if he'd forgotten we were there. He had a strange, strained look on his face, and he started to say something and then just shook his head and came on toward us, walking slowly. I knew Joe well enough to know that he couldn't have been afflicted with buck fever, that paralyzing inability to shoot when suddenly confronted with game which sometimes comes over green hunters. "So what the hell happened?" I asked again. All the other guys were standing there with me looking at Joe. He pushed the bill of his hunting cap back with the barrel of his rifle, shook his head and said, "I saw the damnedest thing back there." He paused, and then in a rush added, "A big hairy thing, kind of man-animal. It was the ugliest, weirdest-looking thing or creature I've ever seen, and fast. It sprang out of the bush about a yard or 2 in front of the buck, and before I even had time to take a good look, it was gone." He looked at each of us in turn. "You know what I'm talking about?" Nobody said anything for a minute. I could tell the rest of the guys were kind of embarrassed. I figured they thought Joe had made up a cock and bull story to explain why he hadn't shot the buck. Joe's face flushed dark purple then. He must have guessed what was going through the guys' minds. "God damn it," he yelled. "Don't you believe me? I'm telling you, I saw this big, hairy thing about 6 feet tall. It looked like a man, except its body was completely covered with a thick coat of hair." There was no mistaking the sincerity in Joe's voice, but still I couldn't blame the guys for not taking him seriously. One of the guys said, "No more beer for you tonight, Joe," and that broke the tension. Everyone then began joking with Joe about the hairy creature, and at first I saw him stiffen with anger, but a few minutes later he shrugged, and I relaxed. There were some jokes about Joe's abominable hairy man from time to time, during the rest of our stay in the cabin, and even for a while after we'd gone back home to Idaho a week or so later. But I saw Joe pretty regularly, and some of the other guys frequently during the next year. Gradually the guys stopped joking about what Joe said he'd seen, and I forgot all about it. Joe and I both drove trucks for the same trucking outfit, although not working on the same truck. Our jobs often took us to various points around the state, but almost never beyond the borders of Idaho. I didn't see a lot of Joe at work, but all through that summer and winter we played poker, or we went to ball games or bowling or double-dated pretty regularly. And then, early that spring, toward the end of March, I heard from one of the guys in the dispatcher's office that Joe had taken off for a 3-week vacation. He hadn't said a thing to me about it the last time I'd seen him, and I figured, knowing Joe, he'd just decided he wanted to get away by himself for a while. When a month went by and Joe still hadn't gotten back, I decided to call his house and see if his family had heard from him. I got his sister on the phone, and she said no, nobody had heard a word from Joe. She didn't sound too concerned. She said, "You know how Joe's always been. He kind of comes and goes. He's not one to be tied down to an exact schedule, especially when it comes to hunting." It was just a couple of nights later that I ran into Ernie Anders, one of the guys who'd been on the trip with Joe and me that previous spring. I hadn't seen Ernie for a couple of months, and we had a couple of beers together. While we were drinking and shooting the bull, Ernie happened to mention Joe and asked about him. I just told him Joe was okay. And then Ernie took a newspaper clipping and passed it on to me, asking if Joe had said anything about it. The clipping was about 6 weeks old, and I hadn't seen it when it appeared in the newspaper. The clipping read, "Prehistoric man may still be alive. Brussels, somewhere in Northeast Asia or on the opposite side of the Bering Sea, in Alaska or British Columbia, a kind of prehistoric man resembling the Neanderthal may still be living. This possibility is advanced in the latest bulletin of the Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. Its author, Belgian zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans, believes that in a small American town he might have seen the body, dead only a few years, of such a man. It happened," he says, "on December 17th, 1968, in Rolling Stone, Minnesota, when a fairground exhibitor named Frank D. Hansen showed him the body of a 6-foot human male of virtually normal proportions, but covered with a thick coat of hair. The body was preserved in ice, and from wounds in his skull and left arm, he appeared to have been shot." Heuvelmans quotes an American geologist, Jack Arthur Ulrich, as testifying that the mysterious being must have been frozen into the ice artificially only a few years ago. By now, I was pretty worried about Joe, figuring that he'd seen the clipping and had gone back up to British Columbia for proof that the prehistoric man-animal was there. That's the kind of fool thing he was capable of. So the next day, I went in and asked for an immediate emergency leave of absence, or my vacation time from the job. They didn't like it much at the place, but they gave me 2 weeks as a vacation. Soon I was on my way to Cassiar, British Columbia. It's hard to say what I expected to find at the old cabin. I hoped maybe Joe'd be there cooking up a pot full of game and I'd look foolish. As it turned out, Joe wasn't there. But even before I went inside, I saw signs that somebody had been there recently. There were horse tracks around the cabin. They'd been made since the winter snowfall. Inside, I noticed Joe's .30-08 Winchester lying on a table. I didn't like that. It wasn't like Joe to go anywhere outside the cabin without his rifle. I picked up the rifle and looked it over. It had been cleaned and oiled since the last time it had been fired, but there was a light film of dust on it. It had been a long, hard day, and I should have been ready to turn in, but I was restless and uneasy. I built up a fire in the stone fireplace and began rummaging through the cabin, looking for some clue to explain what had happened to Joe. Then I came across a notebook marked Diary in the drawer of the table. I noticed a piece of paper sticking out from between its pages. I opened the notebook diary to the page and saw that what had been sticking out was the newspaper clipping. The same one Ernie had showed me about the possibility that prehistoric man might still be alive in British Columbia. I quickly leafed through the diary and saw that there were several entries in it, in Joe's handwriting. The first entry was on March 28th. I took the diary over by the fireplace and sat in the chair and read what he had written for that date. "I'm writing round about midnight. I spent the whole day out in the woods. I ain't seen anything yet. But I could hear movement out there. Movement different from the animal kind. And I sensed something out there. Both my horses have been jumpy ever since we got here. I heard them whinnying all night long last night. And today when I got back to the cabin, I could see where the horses had been pulling at their ropes. Now they kicked the ground up all around the lean-to. Right now the horses are making a lot of racket, like they're scared. There was nothing written under March 29th, but on Sunday, March 30th, there was this: I saw the thing today. It was the first time since I came back. It, or he, or whatever the hell you want to call it, was in a clearing down by the pond 5 miles south of here. Man, it was something to look at too. Too bad I didn't have any goddamn camera to take pictures of it. The camera got busted up. The camera and my telephoto when my pack horse bolted seeing a snake. The man-animal or animal-man was resting near the pond. There were some bones scattered around him on the ground, so I figured he'd just finished eating. And since he didn't know that I was watching him, I had a good chance to get a good look this time. He was near 6 feet tall and built heavy. Heavy body, head, arms, and legs. His arms were longer than those of a man, and he stood upright on his legs. He looked more like a man than an ape, except for the hair all over him, and the face. The face was more ape than man, a flat, caved-in looking thing. He also had a big, squashed-in nose, small eyes, and thick, rubbery lips. The teeth were animal-like too, and jutted out. He was scary looking. At the same time, he was also kind of great looking, because I had the feeling I was seeing a creature from long ago. I had my rifle with me, but I wouldn't want to shoot a creature as rare as this. After a while, he suddenly seemed to sense that I was there. He raised his head and shot out of the clearing so fast it was like I was watching 1 minute, blinked my eye, and he was gone. He ran upright and moved so swiftly there was hardly a sound. Now my problem is, how am I going to get proof of what I've seen? Joe tried to make some rough sketches of the man-animal. He was no artist, but by reading his description and looking at his sketches, I could see a little bit of what the thing looked like. There was nothing written in the diary under the next 2 days, but on April 2nd, Joe had this to say: For the last 2 days, I stayed out in the woods all the time. I made a very important discovery, too. There's more than one of the animal-man creatures out there. There's a small group of them. I've tried to draw what they look like on the 2 pages before this one in the diary. Some of the creatures are smaller than the others. I wonder if they're females. The larger ones, I figure, are males. I tracked the group for most of one day yesterday, but finally lost them. They must have some place, a cave or something, where they hole up in. I wish I could find it. I'm going looking again tomorrow. I flipped to April 3rd and read, this was a bad day. I was out in the woods early and found a couple of the hairy creatures moving through the trees just ahead of me. I started after them, but they disappeared. Then something strange happened. They began popping up all around me every once in a while. After a while, it dawned on me for the first time that they had spotted me. That I wasn't tracking them. They were tracking me. I could hear them grunting back and forth to each other. They were all over the place, popping up first on one side of me, then the other, and in front and back of me. I was afraid they were going to jump me. I panicked. I fired on them for the first time. I kept firing. I used up almost all my ammunition, but they are swift and elusive. I don't even think I winged one of them. I'm convinced that they meant to kill me. I think the rifle was the only way I held them off. I made it back here to the cabin, but I heard them behind me all the way, tracking me. When I got back, both of the horses were gone. The ropes had been bitten through. Tonight, I admit it, I'm scared to death. I wish I hadn't been so damn foolish and come up here alone. I flipped the pages rapidly now, reading on. April 4th. Stayed in cabin all day. I'm sure the hairy sons of bitches were moving around outside about sundown. I shot at them, but I ain't certain whether I hit them or not. I'm running low on grub. God, I'm scared. Gotta do something soon. But what? April 5th. I decided to walk out of the cabin today. But I went a few yards. The goddamn monsters came at me. Shot right out of the brush. Had to use up all my ammo getting back inside the cabin. Just finished the last of the grub. Have to think of something soon. April 6th. Stayed inside the whole lousy day. Food's all gone. So's my ammo. I ain't seen a sign of the hairy creatures once today, but I'm too scared to go out. Got a bad case of the shakes. Real bad. I ain't shook like this ever before in my whole life. Can't stop. If they're still out there, I'm finished. Jesus, please help me. Please, dear God. April 7th. It's 2 days now that I ain't seen a sign of the hairy creatures. I'm gonna have a look around outside. If I don't see them, I'm going to hike back to town today. That was the last entry in the diary. I guess that Joe stuck the diary back in the drawer and meant to take it along with his other gear when he started back to town. But now it appeared he had just vanished. I put the diary in with the rest of my stuff and went to bed. I didn't sleep much that night. And early next morning, I saddled up my horse, packed on my gear, and rode back to town. I decided not to tell anybody in town about the diary, but I told them Joe had disappeared from the cabin, and I wanted to organize a search party to go back and look for him. About 7 men in town volunteered to go along, and we rode back that same afternoon to look for Joe. For the next 3 days, we searched the woods in every direction around the cabin, but we didn't turn up any sign of Joe. Nor of the hairy, prehistoric men or whatever it was Joe had seen. Funny thing though, after we'd finally given up the search and were riding back to town, one of the men, one of the guides who often hunted up in that area, said, "Did you notice a peculiar thing while we were looking for Joe? There were no animals around anywhere. Where do you reckon they'd all gone to?" I never did tell the rest of the men in the search party about the diary Joe left behind. But after I got back to Sandpoint, I began thinking about it, and decided to contact some magazines and see if they'd be interested in printing the story. Now, you've just read it. I figured I could do at least that much for my friend Joe. I know he'd have wanted the world to know what had happened. Editor's note: the editors of Men magazine would like to state for the record that we neither believe nor disbelieve that a creature such as the one described in the article you've just read actually exists. To use a favorite scientific term, it's possible, not probable. However, we printed the article which the author brought to us because we do think it's interesting and fascinating.
So this was, I hope, the first of a series. I'm going to read more pulp adventure stories along these lines. If you liked it, please let me know in the comments. Please also consider checking out my Twitter, my Instagram pages, my Letterboxd, and buying one or ideally both of my ebooks would also be great. And if you really, really enjoyed this video and you want to support the Mutant Museum, you can do so with either coffee or on a monthly basis via Patreon, like all of these cool people, particularly Michael Fattori, Zachary Snowden-Smith, and Break System BSE, and you'll be able to see your own name up here on the very next video. It's as little as $1 a month. And links to all these are, of course, in the description, and thanks for being you.